When we think about drawing in a way to capture the effect of what we see, this isn't something that just applies to grass or leaves or an expanse of water. It applies to every visual aspect that we see when we look at a scene. And that includes the effect of looking steeply uphill, which has its own peculiarities in terms of what it presents to us and the challenge that it presents to an artist wanting to capture that sense of being uphill, of looking uphill. So I thought this house in Tasmania's Port Arthur convict settlement historic site was a great example. This is actually the house that peeked around behind the small building that was in yesterday's video. So this really is now about as far up the top of the hill as I got. So the thing with looking steeply uphill, or steeply downhill for that matter, is because the ground is sloping up, we're probably seeing further and we're seeing from a different position. So what we see changes. It impacts perspective angles. At least for part of any buildings, they can become quite steep because our eye level is down so low relative to the building. And particularly looking uphill, it can also mean we have some objects very close that really very quickly become quite some distance away. And so the depth of plane becomes important. The sense of closer, further away, furthest away is quite important to create a sense of looking up, that there are things close, but as we go up the hill, we're going distance away. And so more generally, the effect of drawing detail. So more generally, the effect of drawing distance, depth of plane, is important with an uphill slope. Now, another really important thing is scale, to get scale right. The way an object changes in size according to how close or far away it is. And consistency within the one scene is the thing that we need to ensure. If we get the scale wrong, parts will look not quite right, or the hill won't look quite right. And we've got these large stone blocks that have been roughly heaped to form a rough wall where the brick wall has collapsed. And this section of wall gives us a great opportunity to do some quite large stones closer, becoming visually smaller as they move uphill. What we do also have to be careful with is any ground level line. We want to make sure that we keep indicating the upward slope at any point where an object hits the ground, which gives us an opportunity to indicate what the slope is. So I start with the colonnade, and it's easy enough to work out where the end of it's going to go just from the distance to the edge of the image. And then I can divide that into 4 equal sections, allowing just approximately for foreshortening as we go along. And now that I've got that corner in, I can bring this wall right up to the house. I didn't finish it while I was doing the rest of the wall because I wasn't sure exactly where that corner of the house was going to sit, and I wanted to have it come up to meet that in a certain way. So the way to do that was to not draw it yet. Now you'll see me in this section doing lots of dotted dashed lines, and I actually changed a number of them during the course of the drawing, but because they were just a series of dots and dashes, at the end of the drawing they blend in to the ground anyway. But if I draw in a heavy line, then besides not sitting right that far away, it would also have drawn attention whatever I did with it. So coming back to the stones and just adding a few shadows and whatnot, when we have hot sun, the way to draw hot sun is to draw black shadows, because that makes the white look whiter, which in a black and white drawing, depending what else is happening in the scene, can give the impression, create the effect of stronger sunlight. Now, looking uphill, one of the most important things is to make sure we get the depth lines of looking up. So this beam across the front of the veranda, we're not just seeing the front, we're actually seeing underneath. We're seeing underneath the beam at least as much as we're seeing the front of the beam. And so we need to allow for that. And whereas normally I may fudge that a bit with just, 3 lines or 4 lines instead of 3 or whatever, in this scene, I want to make sure that I do have that space under the beam so that I can do some hatching, which will also help just give the sense of we're looking up at the lower edge of it. Now, because we're looking up as well, the roof is foreshortened more than it would be if we were standing further back looking straight at it, because the combination of the slope and the pitch of the roof is that it angles up more in line with our eyesight, so we see less of it. And so gives the effect that the veranda section is much taller than normal, or the roof is smaller than normal. And if we were seeing this not on a sloping site, then there'd be something looking not quite right about the proportions of the veranda to the roof. Now, particularly this right-hand side of the building is very battered. The brickwork is very weathered. A lot of the bricks are weathered. A lot of the mortar is weathered. And again, we want to convey that feeling, that effect of age, of weathering. And so I don't use straight lines because the gaps between the bricks are quite pronounced in that section. So I want to leave room to create the effect of the rows of worn bricks. So now I'm working out where I'm going to put the windows. Made them slightly too big. But in drawing a house, there are worse crimes to commit. So I decided not to do all the detail with the smaller panes of glass again, top and bottom sashes, but instead just to simplify it a little bit. Sometimes drawing all the detail can actually draw attention in a way that doesn't happen in the reference situation. And because my windows were a bit large, I needed to slide the door over slightly. But no one's going to know except me and you. I don't do the hatching for the inside the doorway pitch black all over. I allowed it to lighten down the bottom just to give the sense of there's space in there. It's not a black plastic sheet stuck to the front of the door, because that's not the effect we get in life. Now, looking uphill, all the perspective rules still apply, but we need to be careful about ground level. All those perspective diagrams that we look at, they are the way they are, most obviously, when they're sitting on flat ground. When they're not on flat ground, there are other considerations to bear in mind for perspective. I've got on my perspective playlist videos on drawing uphill scenes and downhill scenes for that matter. So if you haven't seen my perspective video playlist, you might like to check it out. There are lots of quite specific situations of perspective and how we deal with it that you might find helpful. And look, if you're finding this video helpful, why not hit the like button? Why not share it with a friend who draws? And I always appreciate your comments below. Let me know your drawing experience. So I'm now doing hatching to represent the shading. Although it was a hot sunny day, there weren't strong shadows. There was a fair bit of upper atmosphere haze and some very light clouds that didn't seem to stop the heat, but did diffuse the light somewhat. So now trying to create the effect of the brickwork. This sort of angle is always a challenge, to spread the perspective angles evenly. And I'm just changing a few of the angles in these last couple of minutes of drawing. You'll see that for the slate roofs, although I think it's actually a wooden shingle roof, I've drawn the lines very close together because of the angle we're looking at. It's a greatly foreshortened view. The biggest danger with drawing an uphill view such as this, allowing that we're reasonably competent in drawing buildings and basic perspective, is that we're just going to shift all the angles slightly and even everything up slightly, especially the ground, and not get the scale as correct, and that overall we'll make this look less steep. We'll make it look more like a building that's closer to us on more level ground. And yet in a scene such as this with a steep uphill, it's often very much the extremes of that view that make this an interesting scene and an interesting subject, worthwhile subject to draw. Now I'm using a 0.3mm pen for the rocks in the foreground and some of the marks for the ground in the foreground, but otherwise I'm using a 0.1mm pen. So it's a bit of an effort doing this large bush behind the tree, behind the house. But this sort of subject placed in this sort of position is really great for creating a sense of drama, for showing definition of an important part of the house. This end corner really makes it pop forward, helps create a sense of depth. But it is good to work hard at creating marks on the paper with our pen that will in some way echo the actual plant that it is. It doesn't have to be recognizable to a botanist, but if we have different foliage from different plants in the one drawing, we do want to have a way of drawing plants that they all look different in our drawing from each other as well. So that took a little bit longer. What I don't want is, I don't want it all equally black, but I also want it all reasonably of some grey value. And so now we're just really coming to the last details. And what I'm doing here is I want to make sure that it's clear that this ground slopes away and then rolls down somewhat in a bit of a weathered, worn down path going up the hill alongside. And the way to do that is to indicate it in the way I draw bits of whatever that's on the ground, sticks and stones and dead leaves, to draw those in a way that indicates the depression, because otherwise it ends up being a bare, rather uninteresting, but also misleading depiction of the ground. Because the weathered ground, the way this furrow has been stamped in as people have tramped up the hill, goes with the weathered cottage, particularly with the weathered broken wall that runs up alongside it. The one reinforces the other. We shouldn't think that the ground is any less important for our consideration of what is the effect I want to create with it and what marks will create that effect, as we do with the house. It's no less important. All the elements will work together. And I decide to make this roof just a bit darker to give it a more mid-grey value. I felt just worked better with the overall values. There's quite a bit of light on the ground. And then take the tape off and we're done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Do you enjoy drawing uphill scenes or downhill scenes for that matter? Or do you avoid them? Do you get into a tangle with the perspective? If you do, I really recommend those two videos of mine, drawing uphill perspective and drawing downhill perspective. But either way, the scenes can be challenging to capture all the elements that make these steep, extreme angles of view interesting drawings. And so it's well worth practicing. And and if you'd like to practice with this scene, of course, you'll find the reference photo on my channel community page. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, uphill, downhill, or around the corner, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.